Welcome to Historican, where we document our stories in our voices. No more filtered history, no more colonizer narratives, just us telling the truth the way it happened. Everyone you'll hear on this podcast today has ties to the Bronx, not just by geography, but by love, by blood, by resistance. For so many of us, the Bronx is more than a borough, it's a stronghold. Especially for Puerto Ricans, it's where we landed, where we built, where we fought to exist. It's where generations of Black and brown families survived systems that were designed to erase us and still managed to create beauty, music, community, and power. In the 1970s, the Bronx was burning. That's the image the world remembers. But they never told us the real story of why. They didn't show us the redlining, the landlord arson, the disinvestment. They didn't talk about how we were left to burn and then blamed for it. But our guest today, Vivian Vázquez Irizarry, lived it. She came back with a film that tells the story, Decade of Fire. It's a documentary, yes, but it's also a reclamation, a love letter, a call to remember. Vivian is a Bronx-born educator, activist, and filmmaker who made sure this chapter of our history was told by someone who lived it, not someone looking in from the outside. Her work reminds us that the Bronx didn't die. We built it. We rebuilt it. We're still here. This conversation goes deep into history, into memory, into what it means to survive and resist. So whether you're from the Bronx or just learning its story, we're glad you're here. So let's get into it. Welcome, Vivian. We're so honored to have you here today.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's my honor, really.
Well, we're so excited to hear this story. So what was your experience growing up in the Bronx during that time?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say I love the title Historican. It's wonderful. I love that title. What was it like growing up in the South Bronx? We can spend a whole 30 minutes on that, but I remember the Jackson Five. I remember the Osmonds. I remember we lived on the same block for many years, and we always had access to the fire escape. So on summers like this, we plopped ourselves on the fire escape. Sometimes my mother would put towels, and one time we put mattresses out there, and we hung out outside the fire escape to keep cool, and saw all our neighbors do the same. I went to a school that was integrated, and so our principal was African American, and we had Puerto Rican teachers and administrators, and also white and Jewish and Italian and Irish. I lived in a building that had all of those people living in it as well. At one point when I was very young, I actually thought I was Mexican because my dad loved ranchero music. And he would listen to Vicente Fernandez and they always played, oh my God, don't tell me, the comedian, guys, help me out. I'll think of it. And he was the old guy with the mustache, the old guy.
Cantinflas?
Cantinflas. So at one point I thought we were Mexican until, I'd go to Puerto Rico and then listen to different music. The way that I grew up in my building, I could, I tell the story all the time. I could walk barefooted to my neighbor's apartment, upstairs, downstairs, ask for food. And at that time, people would always sort of feed me crackers with arroz, not arroz, pero crackers with salchicha. That was sort of the thing to do, to eat. And although we ate arroz con salchicha, we were very connected. My mother's best friend was Jewish, and my father worked in a furniture store, which was on Prospect Avenue along the number 2 line. And so we would walk to his job. My grandparents lived on Hewitt. We would walk to Hewitt Place on 163rd and spend time with our grandparents. I felt like my neighborhood was safe. I didn't understand, as a little girl, I really didn't understand the concept of poverty because I just felt rich. Eventually, by the time I hit middle school, I began to realize that something was going on with my neighborhood because we began to experience fires more and more each day, so I just remember there being a fire, and then all of a sudden, a month later, there was a fire, and then a month later, and then by the time I was a teenager, there were fires raging in my neighborhood every day, several times a day. You ask my sister, and she'll say, "Oh no, I remember the fires during the night," and I'll tell her, "No, no, no, Marcy, the fires occurred during the day." But when we conducted our research, as we did Decade of Fire, we found that there was an average of 30 to 40 fires a day, a night in the South Bronx. So I grew up in that environment. Nevertheless, going to my teenage years, I remember Sweet 16s. I remember weddings. I remember playing softball. I remember sitting on the stoop and, for hours with my friends. I mean, I look at the stoop now when I go back to the block, and it was not very, like maybe 4 feet, 5 feet, but there were 20 of us that would sit on the stoop and just sit there and talk and just, tease each other and talk about each other's lives, and talk about our dreams and, the music we liked and all of that. So on the one hand, I feel like I had a very positive childhood because I felt like I received a lot from community. I was in community, a very strong sense of community. On the other hand, my neighborhood and the context, the backdrop was fire and neglect and abandonment and racism and discrimination. And while we were young and we really didn't understand that, what we did understand in certain respects was that our parents were really suffering from discrimination, in their workplaces and in other places where they had to be, a part of, in hospitals, and when they had to go to interact with other institutions, government agencies for support. So, I say that I had a really great childhood, but it was also a very difficult one.
So I appreciate the richness and the nostalgia that you have and what comes off with your story when you talk about the Bronx. And I know when you started doing this film, you was initially just trying to like get together with friends, right, and just reminisce and stuff. How did it wind up transitioning to the direction that it went in to document the fires and everything that happened?
Yeah, well, when we began to talk about what was going on in the Bronx and what happened back then, I started to invite some of my friends from the old block, right, from what we call back in the day, over to my house. I would, cook arroz con pollo, and we would talk about. So the main question, I would start off each session with, well, what was it like for us? And, immediately people would talk about how much fun we had. I mean, for goodness sakes, we danced the hustle, and ours was the generation of hip hop, but we danced the hustle, we danced salsa. We remember people's, like I mentioned before, the Sweet 16s and how much we hung out and had so much fun. And we spent a lot of time talking about that, but then eventually the tone of the conversation would change and say, oh my God, yeah, those were really rough times. Those were bad times. Oh, there was some, then we would talk about, oh yeah, so what happened to Baldo? What happened to Papo? What happened to Ruthie? What happened to Evelyn? What happened to, oh yeah, she died. Oh yeah, AIDS. Oh yeah, drug addiction, overdose. Then we would sort of appreciate the fact that we were lucky. We were lucky to kind of like still be talking because we lost a lot of our friends from the South Bronx. And I mentioned this to other people who are not from the South Bronx. I think that, like I've attended a lot of funerals over the years. So, that's hard. That's hard. And it's hard for all of us, but, we say that we're resilient. We say that we're strong. But that's another way of saying that we just survived and that we still carry on the legacy of the trauma of having lived through the fires. It's not It's not just a story of like, oh yeah, I lived in a rough neighborhood. Yes, we lived in a rough neighborhood, and across the city, people lived in rough neighborhoods. But we actually lived with the threat of our own home burning. And that was, we didn't know from one day to the next whether we were going to have a home, come back to our apartment, see our apartment burn down. So that sort of creates a kind of fear in our psychic, and a sense of insecurity and a sense of distrust. And so, I believe that a lot of us who grew up in the South Bronx still carry that.
Vivian, I appreciated the how you framed that dichotomy of I mean, I grew up in Gun Hill Projects and I remember it as a beautiful thing. And not till I went to a prep school in New England did I hear from others how bad of a thing it could have been and then have those same reflections. You capture that so beautifully. It brings me to the question, your co-director
Mhm.
was not of and from that place. So
Mhm.
could you tell us of how that connection came to be and sort of the challenges that may have
Mhm.
come with that?
Mhm. There were four of us on the team, right? The core group of Decade of Fire became four. And our impact producer Julia Allen, was a white woman that I actually had hired to work with me in starting a small school in the South Bronx in 2000. And she was an activist. She was an educational activist. She was a housing activist, and she and I got along really well. And we were going to create a curriculum for the incoming ninth graders of this small school that we were just establishing. And she said, oh, it was her idea. Why don't we do the history of the Bronx? And so we started to write out some Bronx history. To make a long story short, the curriculum that we put together was not approved. We were not allowed to teach it because we were told that that some of the topics we had in there, like, was that we were glorifying graffiti, that we were glorifying hip hop, and that it wasn't appropriate, and the graffiti was dirty, and blah blah blah. But nevertheless, Julia kept asking me questions about the things that I would begin to share with her, the stories, like, putting your shoes out by the door, there being a fire on the first floor, and then us running in at 3 o'clock in the morning to, and staying until 6 o'clock till the firemen decided to come, allow us to go back in the building. Those stories, and she was kind of taken aback because she grew up on the Upper East Side. She didn't have that history, although she was an activist. She had encouraged me to write a book, and then I started doing some writing, but it never went anywhere. And then she said, oh, we should do a film. She introduced me to Gretchen, who's my co-director. And Gretchen's a white woman from Vermont who really didn't know much about the Bronx either. Her talents and skills came in the form of being behind the camera. And so I would start to conduct the interviews. Like, for example, when we had the dinners of my friends in my house, Gretchen would be on the corner just with her camera, just taking shots. Gretchen began to help me with the research, and we began to sort of figure out who we should interview. And eventually she became the co-director and editor. So then it was Julia, Gretchen, and then we brought in Neida Martinez, who is a film producer and teaches at the New School for Social Research. And she's a cultural queen of Puerto Rican Latino culture. And she had done one of two films. And so she came on. I call her the madrina of the film because she had a lot of contacts in the film world. Some of the challenges, I would say, were more like, to be transparent, we would write out the story and write out, like, based on interviews that we've had and the research, we would write out a story. And, very soon I would say, no, that's not the way it happened. No. No, it happened this way. It happened that way. But we quickly, recalibrated. I have to tell you that in my partnership with, there are 2 Latinas and 2 white women, but in my relationship with my 2 women allies, they were very supportive. We, by very soon into the filmmaking process, we decided that I was going to be co-director. I didn't have the degree from Stanford, but I had a story to tell, and that had weight in this process and in the credibility of this film, because nothing that was going to be in the film was not going to be approved by Vivian. In fact, we came up with this consensus model where the 4 of us had to agree on just about everything. And it got a little much, like, just to be sort of snide about it. Vivian, what do you think about the graphics? Do you want it orange or yellow? How about that yellow tone versus the orange yellow tone? And sometimes I'd be like, I don't care. Any tone is fine, whatever. But we created a very, very specific and time-consuming, and it was a very passionate process in that we met every Monday for years, every Monday for 2 hours. And just about everything that is in the film was agreed upon by the 4 of us. It took us a long time. It took us, and it wasn't just because of this process. It took us almost a decade to make Decade of Fire. We joke about that. But in terms of the process of making sure that the story was going to be told in my voice. In fact, at the beginning, I was just going to narrate my story. My family story wasn't going to be in it. But the group decided, the group convinced me that I should put in my family story. And I was very hesitant to do that. I felt vulnerable. I was angry, especially upon, reading the research, because as I say in the film, we all knew landlords were burning the Bronx. We all knew city government was abandoning our people. We all knew that there were all these budget cuts that affected our schooling and our hospitals, that the asthma rate was very high. We sort of all know that, right? Growing up, you kind of all know that these things are happening. But then when I delved into the research, I was walking around pretty angry and trying to figure out how to convey and use my voice in this film without that sort of hint of anger, or just like, I'm not an angry person anyway, I'm pretty diplomatic, but it just got me so angry. And it was my film partners who said to me, yeah, we're going to walk with you through this anger. We're going to walk with you through this vulnerability. We're going to take our time to figure out how to help you find your voice in talking about these things, and talking about, when, like, for example, the part in the film where I'm crying. Do you guys remember that part when I sort of get a little emotional? And I tried not to get emotional a lot in the film, but at that point it caught me off guard, because what I was actually reading was there was a request by the then district attorney of the Bronx, Mario Morolla, to asking the FBI to come and investigate the arson incidences in the Bronx. And this was already by 1974, 75. The Bronx had already been raging for 10 years. And the FBI just completely said no. Like, we don't have anything to do with that. And, and what I had in front of me were documents where, you guys can appreciate this now because of what we're going through. Just government agencies not caring. No one really is saying, oh, we've got to figure out what's going on there. Like, why is that place burning? What's happening? And at that point, I just got really, emotional. That, like, oh, wow, nobody really cared. Like, what? Why? So my partners, this is a long-winded way of saying that my partners were very supportive. We're actually making a film now together again. We can talk about that later.
Yes, I definitely want to hear about that. Yeah. And I'm glad you were saying that, when you were talking about, just the weight of it and, getting emotional and stuff, because I wanted to ask you, was there any moments where you were like, I can't do this, or it's too much? Because like I remember in the film, there's a point where you're at the, I guess at the getting the reports on the fires from the fire department, and he gives you a stack, and then he's like, that's not even all of them. There's a lot. There's probably hundreds, thousands that were never reported.
Yeah. I think that there was a point at which I never said, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this. I mean, you know, we were all working full-time in different jobs, and we were working on the film part-time until at the very end, we were able to get some money together to, you know, to help pay for some of our expenses. But there was a point where I became like apathetic, you know, reading Joe Flood's book in terms of the fires and how many fires and the lack of response by the fire department. I remember sitting with my team, actually with Gretchen, and saying, yeah, so what? Like, yeah, that happened. Yes, it happened. You know, I was just so fed up. I was like, yes, it all happened. And then, can I curse on this Zoom thing? So, you know, she said to me, but Vivian, that was really fucked up. Like, you know, you've got to take it, you know, like, because I think at one point I was just like, yeah, that happened. And I just couldn't hear any more, you know, just bad news, or just the researcher just got me a little bit like, oh, yes. And she's like, no, we've got to work this out because this is really fucked up. And then that became a point where we were also having this discussion at the same time about who the film was going to be for, who's the audience, right? So as we're writing proposals and figuring out how to sharpen the story, you know, oh yeah, who's the film going to be for? We need a national audience. Oh yeah, we need to make it international. And then I was like, no. This film is for the people of the Bronx. This film that's the first tier. So if I'm going to go through this, if we're all going to go through this and we're going to tell the story, it is to tell it for the people of the South Bronx. And that sentiment carried me throughout the film. Like, I need to do this. I mean, so much so that in our premiere, we were able to convince one of our funders to give us money so that we could purchase the tickets for people in the Bronx, because it's kind of rare that you have Bronx people attend premieres downtown, you know, all the way downtown. People, you know, some of our people don't have the money, or they're not used to like going to the premieres of these films. You know, you always get a sort of certain audience that go. And what we did was, of all the people that we interviewed, that we talked to, that I reached out to during the making of the film, we got them all free tickets. So one of the things that happened was that audience of that in that premiere was like 65% people from the Bronx, because that's what I wanted to see happen. We wanted to show this film, and you know, we've been showing it in the Bronx for quite some time, but that carried me. You know, that desire and that passion, like, oh no, we need to tell this story, and we need to flip the script on what has been told about us.
And I can imagine also your son being and your kids being a motivating factor. Like, before we even, you know, started this, you know, episode and stuff, we were talking amongst ourselves about the importance of preservation of our history. You know, I wanted to talk to family members, the elders, and hearing that story and preserving it. So was that a sense, do you have a sense of pride that you were able to do that with your son too, and the conversation that you had in there?
Oh yeah. But yes, but I was going to say that my son has known about Mariana Bracetti and Albizu Campos and Betances and Hostos before I made my film, you know, so he just didn't know about Hector Lavoe and Mark Anthony. He knew, you know, my kids knew about our other leaders and mentors and you know, ancestors. He was very interested. And I have two daughters. One was away and one was in school away. And so, but yeah, they're very proud. But quite frankly, when, and how do I talk about this? When you're telling a story about like your community, well, when I was telling this story, I also felt very vulnerable that I wanted to make sure that the community would accept my story. I felt like I'm putting myself out there. And are people going to say, that didn't happen, that happened? That sounds like my mother, the way I just talked. Eso no pasó. Tú exagera, and so I was worried that my community would say, okay, yeah, that sounds right. More than anybody, I was kind of nervous about how the community would receive the film.
If I may say, I think something that's, and I'm taking notes as we're talking, I think something that stands out the most is one, the importance of when we are putting our stories out there, that we do keep our lens at the forefront, and that our people, our community is always the first tier when we're considering who's the audience and, what are we doing this for? Because it's very clear in other circles, we are not the ones that are being put at the forefront, when work and film and art is being produced. So it's important for us to continue to see ourselves as the top tier and make sure that we're putting the work out there for us, by us. And what you're saying now about that vulnerability, I think something that I'm also hearing from you, and is as someone who considers themselves an artist as well, the importance to be vulnerable and just hold on to the hope and the faith that your community, the same way that they nurtured you as a child and, giving you, your crackers and salchichas and, all those conversations and all the support from the neighborhood, that they're going to give you that back again when you put the work out there, because it is an ode, it is a love story, it is a reflection of the good, the bad, and a call to action from that history. So, I mean, and I know we weren't really discussing a sequence of events here, but being that I know you're in Wakefield, I'm still in the Bronx, there's a lot of parallels happening in our community directly right now. And I've been emotional throughout this conversation because, I was impacted by a fire in January and displaced, and the building is basically sitting there rotting away. And, now we're getting into the legalities of things, and it was about 280 of us, and, 80%, 85% of the people are still displaced.
Wait,
And,
the Allerton fires?
Yes, that's where I live. And so, in referencing the film and then just hearing you speak, I'm just like curious, like, where do you see the parallels, and also kind of like a cautionary tale, right? Because when we take the effort to unpack history and share history with our community, it's not just, giving facts and giving a timeline, but it's also, how do you connect to this, unpack it, and use it to empower and hopefully move forward change. And as someone, and us as a collective, that I know, that's a big part of our mission. We want to make sure that we're sharing the history, but also empowering and motivating people to be out there and to move change and to be a part of those systems of positivity. Like, what are the parallels that you're seeing, and what are some things that you feel we, particularly those of us still in the community, could do to, just make sure we don't see a 2.0 of this happening again?
Wow, it's said a lot, Jessica. The interesting thing is that I was looking at an article the other day from City Limits, and they were talking about how the city needs to put more money into the maintenance of buildings, and that this is a negotiation that is taking place with landlords and the city budget and the state. There was an article, and I can't place the article, after the Allerton fires that showed that these fires are happening because of the lack of maintenance in the building, that landlords are not taking care of certain, certain requirements, they're not abiding by code, they're not cleaning enough, they're letting the wires get old. And those buildings on Allerton were pretty old, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so
I have been there 15 years, but we have residents that have been there 40 plus.
right,
The building was built in like 1932, something to that effect. Yeah, so it's
right.
very old.
They're very old buildings, and so they need, so there was this discussion about whether they should give like incentives to landlords. The thing about that is that people need to be aware of those things. There are more fires happening across the city of New York than ever before, not like in the South Bronx, but the number of fires is increasing. Fires are happening, and not just in New York City, but in other places. And so we need to look at that. Folks need to and this is very difficult, right? Organizing around housing, because let's just say, Decade of Fire, one of the goals of Decade of Fire was to bring about a conversation of the housing crisis on a national level, right? We were trying to elevate that conversation. What is happening with housing? Why are so many people being evicted? Why are there so many fires? Why, because now fires are, like I said, are expanding. Why is there such a housing crisis? There are 90,000, there's a shortage of 90,000 apartments and homes in New York alone. What is going on, right? And it is such a complicated monster, the whole housing policy, understanding housing laws, understanding housing code, all of that. However, it requires us to kind of figure out where we could get involved in those conversations. And I think it starts, for me, not so much the national level, but the very local level. The assembly people, the city council people, the commissioner of housing, people who are doing the work to figure out, to help us educate ourselves about, like, for example, what were the violations that your landlord had? And now, as a person who has been displaced, what are your rights to come back to the apartment and to make sure that that apartment is going to be up to code, right? And that somehow you receive some kind of compensation. What are the laws behind that? And just talking to people on a very local level, so that you all can come together to see something on your behalf, and then educate others, and then continue to sort of expand that. That's what I would do. If being in the Bronx, and if something happened on my block, I would then figure out, what is it that affects my block? What are the laws? What are the policies? What are the codes that affect my block? Whether it be transportation or medical services. Why is it that, like, for example, and this is very Bronx focused, but why is it that Montefiore is closing clinics when people need healthcare more than ever? What is that? Let's figure out what that's like. So I can keep going on and on, but that's my best answer.
Yeah, but I think that's important, especially for youth and young people to hear, because it is easy to get apathetic and just be like, well, it is what it is. And it's the reality that we live in. And look, historically, nothing new, right? It's real easy for it to get passed off that way. And so that's why, in having this conversation today, I just feel it's really important, to hear that, from you, someone who has that experience, that closeness, and the richness of the research that you did,
Right.
that yes, there might be parallels, and yes, there are some things that, might resurge and, kind of,
Yeah.
cyclical processes. But it's still critical that, we stay invested in the community, and education is
Right.
key.
Right. Because, it's the people. There are people who are making decisions. It's not, AI is not really making decisions about our lives at this point. People are making decisions. Who are those people? And how do we impact those people? Right now they want to expand the Cross Bronx Expressway by 2 lanes, and that's going to cause a lot more pollution, and it's going to really negatively impact the quality of life of people who live along the Cross Bronx. And people need to understand what that means, and that's been a tough battle, sort of trying to educate people about that, not just, riders, but the people along the Bronx River, and, where the Cross Bronx begins and where it ends. We need to be aware that there are people who are making decisions to our detriment in the community. And so how do we get involved and impact that?
And I think your movie shows great light and can really inform us on what we can do. Like, because in the documentary, you talk about, the coalitions that were formed, the organizations that formed, the Young Lords, all these different groups of people who came and they started organizing and, to repair and rebuild and take stands for their communities. And I think that's such an important thing that we need now more than ever.
Yeah, we do. And we need to, we need to educate each other, and we need to act. Yeah.
Do you feel a sense of justice or like redemption? Because the way things were being portrayed in those days, I know you said in the documentary, that they were blaming you guys for, the community. They were blaming the people of the community for these fires. And now that your documentary is like saying that this is what happened, and it's putting it out there on a platform for everyone to see, like, there was some shady things going on.
Yeah. I'll tell you that when we screened Decade of Fire across the country, in many different places, I think that I must have done like 100 screenings in different, for different social activist groups, housing justice groups, organizing groups, and we traveled to different places: Miami, Kentucky, I don't know, Rhode Island, Rochester. We were everywhere, California, Chicago. And one of the things that I feel like when I talked earlier before about whether the community felt that it was an accurate story, the audiences, no matter where they came from, whether it was Baltimore or California, people said, you talked about injustice and policy, and I get it. The same thing happened in my neighborhood. It wasn't fires, but we got redlined. There was urban renewal where I lived, and they just swept away my neighborhood and they destroyed my community. We heard that from a lot of people. That gave me a sense of what you're calling redemption. Like, okay, people can identify, and they're speaking this, this truth to these powerful policies that affected and impacted so many of us. So when I hear people say, yeah, I grew up in Baltimore, but the same thing happened here. Yeah, I grew up in California, in Oakland, and we're still struggling, for justice in housing or in our neighborhood. That has made me feel like, okay, so we have been able to allow people to sort of make an impact. Another thing that the film did, and it wasn't redemption, but I feel like it was important. And that is that when for many audience members across the places we screen, people were re-traumatized. The film, brought back some memories, and so we needed to have these screenings where people would have an opportunity to talk about what they went through, and share and reflect. And so it wasn't redemption, sort of. I don't want to call it that, but I felt good that it allowed people to to reflect and to heal, if possible, to heal from some of that. And even some students here at CUNY, I remember when we did a screening there, this young woman started to cry, and she said that her grandfather, like, she never paid attention when he always said, you need to have your shoes by the door, you need to do this, you need to do that. And then her grandfather had just passed away, and she said, I never understood him, I thought he was a crazy man. Now I understand, and I'm so sorry that I always, like, she kind of like ignored him. So in that way, I felt that that people were allowed to sort of express their emotions. And the other thing, I don't know, I'm sort of putting it in a different frame, Joseph, but we didn't interview a lot of people who made those decisions, like with redlining, and we didn't go after the Roger Stars or people. We did try to chase landlords, but we did. People would tell us, why don't you interview all these people, all these policymakers? And our response was, they already told their story. That's the narrative that we're trying to debunk. So we don't want, I don't want to hear from them. I want to hear from my community. We want to hear our community's version. And in that way, we were able to, also feel good that that it's a story by the community. I mean, it's my family's story, but we interviewed so many people in the community, and we were only able to bring forth just a few characters in the film, but that made us feel good.
I'm curious. Thank you for that, because it's so hard to relive history without the healing. It's so hard, and that gift, I'm so much more appreciative even, and I'll appreciate it more when I watch it again. I'm curious what you're working on now.
So, Jessica, this is where
Yes.
you're gonna have to give me some. Oh, did you hear that?
Yeah, I'm hearing it too.
Thunder.
It's raining. We
It's
got some
thundering.
lightning and
Yeah.
thunder over here in the
All right.
Bronx.
It's not my kids with fireworks. Okay, good.
Because you had mentioned it before, and that's the vulnerability piece. So I don't know if you remember in Decade of Fire when we covered the piece on the New York City budget crisis. There was a financial control board that was established to make budget cuts, right? The banks had refused to continue to provide New York City with the loans that they needed to carry on the debt. New York City had a lot of debt, and the banks refused to issue debt at some point and said, nope, we're not going to issue any more debt until you guys cut schools, cut daycare programs, cut teachers, cut. That was called the Financial Control Board. In New York City, they were called Big Mac, right? And they arguably became the model of where private bankers take over city budgets, especially city budgets that are in trouble. And then they create austerity measures, and they hold cities hostages, and they basically say, well, your city budget is in trouble. We're going to make the decision and undemocratically about how you're going to spend your money. We're going to, hijack you and say, nope, you can't do this anymore. The important thing is that they cut social services, essential services in communities, and then through their debt apparatus, eventually make billions of dollars through these cuts. So that's called austerity, right? That became the model for how cities are who are in financial trouble deal with their problems, and then also, it increases privatization. So I'm sorry, I'm taking a long time because I'm still trying to articulate it. So let's look at La Junta in Puerto Rico, and what La Junta, the Financial Control Board, when it was imposed in 2016, when Governor Padilla said they can't pay their bills, they came into Puerto Rico and they said, well, we're going to manage your budget for you because you guys don't know how to manage a budget. You have a debt of $43 billion plus another $10 billion debt with the electric company, and we're going to cut services. We're going to privatize the electric company. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And so we're looking at how austerity measures have impacted places like, well, starting with New York City, what it looked like in Detroit, because Detroit went through a bankruptcy in 2013 where they cut off the water of over 100,000 families and devastated communities in Detroit. It was so bad. And then right after Hurricane Maria, my mom was there and we brought her back, and then we started to look at it and say, okay, what's going on over there? And we realized that there is a financial control board that is really decimating the island's economic future. I mean, just to kind of put it in, you guys might know this, and I'm really sorry, I don't mean to lecture you, but the goal of the junta really is to make Puerto Rico accessible to the Wall Street markets. It's not to help Puerto Rico prosper economically. That's not the goal. The goal was to get it out of debt so that it can again be good for the credit, the credit industry, for racialized capitalism. In the meantime, Wall Street has been making billions of dollars off the tragedy that's happening in Puerto Rico. 400 schools have been closed, clinics have been completely privatized, the airport has been privatized, the electric company has been privatized. And you guys know what's happening there with Luma and the constant blackouts. I mean, everything's being privatized. And in all of their work, the work of the junta and the government, there has not been any type of economic development plan for the island. So our film is all sort of about that, and we're in the kind of the process, which is why I'm talking a lot, because we're still trying to kind of shape it. But what I was going to tell you is, so then it's told from the story of someone from the diaspora, right? So now I'm there, right? I'm here in the Bronx, metiéndome ahí, right? Figuring out how to tell the story from the diaspora point of view, right? My parents are there. I have family there, and I love Puerto Rico. I go all the time, but I'm not from, I'm from here, and I'm from there because that's my mother country, and I still have the umbilical cord tied there. But who am I as a woman from the diaspora telling this story? So you can maybe offline, you can give me some advice about, like, who am I to be telling this story, right? Because we care about Puerto Rico. I care about Puerto Rico, and why is it that, and just not Puerto Ricans, but everybody has to care about what's happening in Puerto Rico. Even people who are not Puerto Rican should be caring about what's happening in Puerto Rico.
Right.
So that's.
I mean, I think Vivian, the story is in safe hands with you. And I think also we actually had a conversation amongst ourselves, one of our episodes, ni de aquí ni de allá, right? Like, are you Puerto Rican enough? But what does it mean to be Boricua? And that's also something that I think, and I'm processing it as you're saying, like, who am I to tell the story? But the reality of it, and I think, we kind of came to this in our group reflection, is that, you said the umbilical cord, right? Like, we're continuously and forever tethered to our homeland, and keeping that connection and, elevating the importance and relevance of our connection, I think comes through the work that you're doing. Hopefully the work that we're trying to do here on Historican, that it's really showing that regardless whether you're from the diaspora or not, that you can still help your community near and far, right? So, I'm excited, and, I know how that feels with the processing and like, where is this going to go? But I'm sure that the story is in very good hands. I'm excited to see what continues to come from that reflection and dive.
Thanks.
I just imagine you have traveled such a emotionally wrought and hard road. And I just wonder what you wish you would be able to tell more people about that journey.
Um, it's emotionally hard. And one of the kind of like the threads of that challenge, those challenges now with this film is that, well, first of all, like with Decade of Fire, like I didn't think I was a filmmaker, and I was going through that, and I'm like, who am I to tell the story? Because and now with this one, it's deep rooted in economics and learning debt and economics on Wall Street and the credit and capital bond market. Like I don't have that background. And so I wake up conducting research in a topic that I'm not familiar with. I'm now familiar with it, but I didn't start out having any knowledge about like Puerto Rican economic development since it was taken over by the US. So part of it is like, oh my God, am I going to get this? Am I going to understand this? How do and in talking to people, that makes it hard because it's not just like, oh yeah, Puerto Rico's not doing well, but why isn't Puerto Rico doing well? How do I educate myself? How do we, learn this information and share it? That's hard. The other part is, do people care? Right? Like, okay, like reading about these things that are happening with Luma, for example, and the power outages and the history of the electric company. Do people care about that? How do we, and that kind of makes me worried. And then the other thing, Joey, is that I feel like what gets me through. So it's like the ambivalence and sort of the uncertainty of my own capacity sometimes to figure things out, because this is hard stuff. It's very academic. Someone said, "Oh, do you have a background in economics?" I'm like, "No, I don't." Do you know about Wall Street? Oh, I'm learning it now. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that from an emotional standpoint, I keep hearing my grandparents talk to me about how important that is. I think about now, I'm getting emotional because I keep thinking about my grandmother and how much she, her life, and my grandfather and my great grandmother. And I keep thinking about them and saying, what can I do for you? Like, how do I honor you and your struggle and your life and the love and their courage? So it's sort of, it kind of pushes me, it kind of inspires me to keep going, even though sometimes I feel like I'm falling into an abyss with what we're trying to say and what we're trying to do in Puerto Rico.
The universe works in amazing ways. Right before we got on with you, we just talked about the importance of elders in conversations.
Mm.
And you felt the energy. I really, really, really appreciate that.
And
Thanks.
I also wanted to add that as I also am a documentary filmmaker, and one of the reasons I was inspired to do that work was films like yours, but just to kind of speak on who am I to tell this story? My first documentary, well, major documentary film was with Palante Se Prepante with Iris Mora.
Oh, uh-huh.
Yeah. I was the co-producer on that. And she brought me on for the very same reasons you talked about, which was she had done all these interviews. They were sitting in a box. And here I was, a very young film student, and I was like, I want to see this film. And the idea of who cares about this anymore? Why is this, do people even want to hear this story? I was like, we don't know this story. My generation we don't know the story. We need to hear it. Who better than someone who is walking that or who went through it? And even if you didn't, the whole Puerto Rico angle right now is still so important because we can't wait for somebody else to tell it. We want someone in our community to tell that story. And I think it is so important as documentary filmmakers, what you're doing. This is very inspirational for me, very personally inspirational for me.
Thank you, Vanessa. What are you working on now?
This, we're,
Okay.
what we're trying to do with this, and I have another company similar, it's called Rebel Roots, is really to start preserving our history via the storytellers, via people who have a story to tell and create kind of an archive, a video archive for not just us, but for our children and our grandchildren to be able to go back and hear the stories that are not told from our perspective. So
Yeah.
that's super important for me.
Yeah. You just reminded me, I was interviewing my tias in Puerto Rico, and I wanted to know more about, what was happening with the family, some family history. And there's this house that they bought in Sabana Grande, and they were very proud of this house, that they all finally, and my dad being here contributed a lot to the house and stuff. And so I'm like, how did they pay for the house? My question was, well, how did they pay for the house? And my tia goes, pero tu abuela vendía las bolitas,
Yeah.
Y se ganó, ella se pegó $500 y con eso se compró la casa. And I'm like, we didn't know this story. Oh my God. The reason why we had this house is because my grandmother se pegó, and I just found it amazing that there's just like, it's not like, earth shattering, but for my sisters and I, it was earth shattering. Like, oh, wow, she played, that's what she did. That's what my grandmother did to make a living.
Mm-hmm.
It was something.
Yeah. We were just having that conversation about how we need to interview our own elders, our own grandparents, and record this history because whether, it's important to us, but it's also important to other people because we can see and recognize our grandparents and our tias and tios in other people. Like I was telling them, I saw somebody put together a clip. They do a series of just their grandfather's voicemails to them. And I cried the whole time listening to it because I was like, it sounds like my abuelo. Like, so it's the things that resonate with all of us being from the diaspora, being Puerto Rican, being from the Bronx, whatever these commonalities are what ties us together. So whether it's your story or mine, it's still kind of my story too.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Someone should do a documentary about how our families acquired land. Like, what was that? Because it was taken away, by the the 30s, 80% of the land was in the hands of land barons, U.S. I think it was 3 U.S. Sugar plantain owners, 80% of the land they had. And then eventually in 1950, they started giving the land to the people. I wonder how that happened. I mean, our film can't cover that, but it's just so interesting. And now, of course, that there's mass gentrification occurring on the island. And people can no longer afford to buy their own homes in Puerto Rico. When before, it was sort of when we grew up, it was a given that our families had homes. Right? But now young people can't buy homes over there.
Vivian, we just want to thank you for your time. We want to respect your time as well. Thank you for taking the time out to meet with us. Your inspiration. Thank you for all you've done, all you're doing.
Thank you.
in education and even filmmaking now. Thank you so much. And you're an inspiration to us, as you know, as I've been someone myself, like, who am I to do this podcast with, you know, my friends, and like, and as it's been unfolding, it's just like, oh wow, this is you know, building some momentum. We appreciate you, and again, just thank you so much again for taking the time out to be with us. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you for, you know, telling our stories. Thank you so much for doing that and for expanding the reach. You know, expanding the conversation and expanding the reach is so important. So I salute you guys. Te bendición, te bendigo, right? Te bendigo. You see, even my Spanish, te bendigo.
Bendición.
Gracias.
Miguel,
Muchísimas
thank you so
gracias.
much.
Bendición, yes.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks, Vivian.